Hey everyone, my name's Amy, and today we're going to be talking about a recent episode of the Joe Rogan Experience podcast. Recently, he had Dr. Paul Saladino, also known as the Carnivore MD, on his podcast, and for 3 hours they talked about nutrition. Some of it was actually correct, but not everything. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Alright, so if you really like this video at any point, please give it a big thumbs up. Do not forget to subscribe. Also, check me out on all of this social media so that you can see daily tips and information about fitness, nutrition, and veganism. Now, let's get started. So, before we get into this video, let's look at 3 specific things that Dr. Saladino does throughout the entire 3-hour-long podcast that are not the best ways to look at nutritional science. Number 1, everything is related to our ancestors. He utilizes this as almost a way to weasel around modern nutritional science, as if there's some special thing that our ancestors used to know about nutrition that we currently don't. This is why modern nutritional science exists, to be able to help us tease out what exactly is beneficial for humans, because potentially what we used to be eating might have been survival food and not the ideal thing that would be the most beneficial and healthy for us. Number 2 is he uses mechanistic data to try to prove causality. So what this means is that throughout the entire thing, he's going to utilize studies that were done in a petri dish to try to say that a plant toxin causes something bad, therefore you shouldn't eat this plant at all. While studies that are done in a petri dish are beneficial for exploring new areas that we should do studies in people with, or for looking at the data that we already have in people and trying to find how it functions on a cellular level, you cannot just use studies done in a petri dish to prove causality by itself. And the third is unsubstantiated claims. I'm going to throw this out here right now, and we're going to address this later, but there is literally no research out there on organ meat and any special benefits for people, even though he claims this. So these are just 3 things to keep in mind while we go through the rest of this video.
So I won't debate that plants can be beneficial as medicine, but to use them as food presupposes that molecular hormesis is good for us. And I'll tell you why I don't think it is. So when you go in the sauna, or when you are in ketosis, or when you're in the sun, or when you exercise, you do generate reactive oxygen species, superoxide radicals, and they activate a system in your body called the NRF2 system. I can pull up a picture of it in a second. And that turns on genes that are involved in the antioxidant response to manage these free radicals. And so when we think about oxidative stress, we're talking about molecules pulling electrons from other molecules, creating free radicals, which is broadly means that there are unpaired electrons. Now, these are very reactive molecules that can then create things like lipid peroxides or free radicals within proteins, which change the conformation of the protein. And we know these can be damaging for humans, but a little bit of oxidative stress, or just the right amount, the Goldilocks amount, is necessary for life. We don't want to get rid of all of the oxidative radicals in our body. They're critical signaling molecules at the level of the mitochondria. So this whole movement toward antioxidants and more antioxidant chemicals is eventually, if we snuff out all of the oxidative radicals or all the reactive oxygen species in the human body, we'll be dead. We need these for signaling.
So I have 3 issues with what Dr. Saladino says right here. Firstly, he's correct about the fact that we do need some oxidative stress in order for us to be able to keep living healthy, much in the same way that we need a little bit of inflammatory omega-6 oils in our diet in order for us to have an inflammatory response to things such as cuts or even getting sick, and that inflammatory response helps us heal. Now, the issue I have is the idea that we can snuff out all of the oxidative stress in our bodies. There's nothing that I've seen that shows that this is possible. However, there is research showing that you can actually have too much oxidative stress, and this is why antioxidants are important. Number 2, he assumes that every single antioxidant does the exact same thing. And we don't really have to look too far in order to see that this is not absolutely correct. Let's quickly look through some antioxidants found in berries to see why this actually isn't the case. Strawberries, for example, are able to decrease LDL oxidation, which we'll be talking about in a little bit and why that's a bad thing, versus blackberries, which actually have the ability to help protect neurons specifically. Blueberries, on the other hand, don't do either of those things, but can instead help our eyes and help fight against diabetes. And if we compare all of this to glutathione, which is the antioxidant that is preferred by Dr. Saladino because we make it ourselves, that one doesn't even do any of those specific things. That one's more of a jack of all trades, master of none, doesn't really have those specific things that those berries do have. And so by assuming that every single antioxidant does the exact same thing, you're actually minimizing the impact that antioxidants have on a person's body.
I think that there certainly are studies with molecules like sulforaphane, which is this isothiocyanate compound from broccoli, that show that it also triggers NRF2. It triggers this antioxidant response system. But what we aren't told about much is the other side effects of sulforaphane, the so-called package insert that sulforaphane has. And when you look at that, there's a large amount of evidence that this whole class of molecules, isothiocyanates, actually have many negative effects on the body. And when you think about it from a plant's perspective, sulforaphane is pretty clearly a toxin. It's a booby trap. So it's a booby trap. It's like, if you're going to eat me, I'm going to make this molecule. It's going to affect you. It's going to be a pro-oxidant, right? Because if you look at the chemistry of sulforaphane, it actually is a pro-oxidant, meaning it's pulling electrons from other molecules. It's not actually coming into our body and acting as an antioxidant. It's turning on our antioxidant defense system, but it's also doing other negative things in the human body. In the case of isothiocyanates, it's actually been shown to damage DNA, which is a process called clastogenesis, and it inhibits iodine absorption at the level of the thyroid.
Here he claims, without citing any evidence in this podcast, that sulforaphane will affect our thyroid and cause thyroid issues. However, there is actually not very much evidence that this is true. And the evidence that does exist that shows that this could be a possibility is rat studies. However, recently there was a study done for 12 weeks in people where they supplemented them with sulforaphane and glucoraphanin, which is the molecule that mixes with the enzyme myrosinase to make sulforaphane, and they found that there was no effect on a person's thyroid. They actually recorded that there was a decrease in hypothyroidism in the group that was supplementing with the sulforaphane. No, sulforaphane doesn't affect your thyroid.
The sustainability or the scalability argument is so important to consider. So when I think about this, I think about it from a couple of perspectives. There's the land use perspective, but there's also just the actual mathematics of it, that 99-ish% of cows that we eat that are grain finished had 85% of their life on grass. They're not raised from calves in the factory farm. So, then I think, like, wait a minute, we're already raising all of our cattle on grass for 85% of their lives. We're just sending them to factory farms at the end. And I think it's a consumer-driven thing.
All right, so let's talk regenerative agriculture. I'm only going to be able to talk about it a little bit here, but Earthling Ed just finished a video that is amazing for this topic, so please go and check that out. Dr. Saladino is correct in the fact that cows are originally raised on grass. However, it's not as easy as just switching over the food that a cow eats. Grass-fed cows only grow at about 1.4 pounds a day versus cows that are raised on grain, which grow somewhere between 2.7 to 3.3 pounds a day. So according to this study, in order to have the entire United States switch from a feedlot system to a grass-raised cattle system, we would actually see an increase of about 23% in the national cattle herd, which means that there would be 23 million more cattle that would be raised in the United States. This would then increase total methane emissions by 8%. And if all of these cows were to be exclusively pasture-raised, like Dr. Saladino would prefer, then we could only raise 27% of the amount of cattle we are currently raising.
And if you look at hunter-gatherer tribes, that's what we see.
Yeah.
There, and it's so interesting to me that they have a preference for animal foods.
Yeah.
A lot of them will eat tubers occasionally. There's actually a pretty cool study. I think you'll find it in the anthropology folder, Jamie, or it's termed Hadza fallback foods. It's the fourth one there. And this is such a cool study. I really want to go spend time with the Hadza next year.
My friend David Cho did.
I heard him on the podcast.
Dude, that is staying fit isn't a New Year's resolution for these hunter-gatherers. Oh, that's the Hadza.
2017, they did a study where they strapped heart rate monitors on 200 or so, 198 different Hadza men and women, and tracked them to see what their cardiovascular fitness was.
It's probably off the charts. Examination of blood pressure, cholesterol, and other biomarkers showed no evidence of risk factors for cardiovascular disease. Yeah, they're probably super fit.
So, throughout the entire 3-hour-long podcast, Dr. Saladino keeps talking about the Hadza Bushmen almost as a society that follows a carnivore diet, and they do not. So this part of my research I have to credit to Kevin Bass, who is a researcher who has a Twitter account and a blog called Diet Wars, which is pretty amazing. He posted a series of tweets highlighting this, and I'm going to present some of that information right here. So what he presented was that the Hadza Bushmen actually eat about 80% of their diet from plants, specifically tubers and berries. Not to mention, none of them actually have meat as their number one preference. According to the study that Dr. Saladino cites, it's right behind honey for men and behind honey and berries for women. Not to mention, this study actually looked at the composition of different parts of the Hadza diet and found that the majority of their fat intake was coming from baobab seeds, which is high in polyunsaturated fats, which Dr. Saladino thinks is the dietary root of all evil. And this is the reason why the Hadza Bushmen have such good lipid profiles. This and the fact that they exercise so much.
Was one of those goofy vegan doctors who looks like was on this podcast, and he was talking about how he got really, really sick because he picked these berries.
Elderberry.
Yes.
I've seen the video.
Yes.
Elderberry's completely toxic raw.
How the are you giving nutrition advice where you don't even know that this is a toxic berry?
And so some berries are toxic. But if you think about fruit, more fruit is edible than not.
Right.
But yeah, I thought that was a hilarious video.
It's hilarious.
He's talking about drooling.
That guy, look, I don't want to mention his name. I'm sure he's a nice person, and I think he's trying to do well. I think he's just trapped in an ideological paradigm. He's like he's locked into this world and applauded, and that's where he gets his love from. And if you leave that world, by God, I've seen people do it, and they get attacked in the most vicious and horrific ways. When their body is falling apart and they incorporate salmon, and all of a sudden they start getting erections and they start feeling better, people will attack them. It's like I understand where these people are coming from in terms of them not wanting to do harm. I understand it. I see their perspective. But the vicious ways they attack people that leave I'm going to call it a cult, because it's kind of like a cult. It's a dietary choice. It's a lifestyle choice, but it's an ideology as well. There's parts to it. But
it's a meme.
That poor guy looks like dog. He looks so bad, and for him to be espousing this as a method of achieving health and wellness, you're like, come on, man, do you have a mirror in your house?
I want to do like
he's bloated. It's like crazy.
It's crazy.
He's got this barrel chest. He's no muscle at all. He's like sticks for arms. His neck is barely holding his head up. It's so strange. It's like, my God. And there are very healthy vegans, by the way.
This is an absolutely horrible conversation, which is the reason why I want to talk about it. They might not want to mention the name of the person they're talking about, but I will. They're talking about Dr. Greger. No, he's not a bodybuilder. No, he doesn't really try to lift weights, but he's still healthy. And to be honest, you shouldn't necessarily determine how healthy a diet is based upon what a person looks like. That's not how you determine the nutritional adequacy of a diet. And I see so many people saying this. Not to mention, if you have an issue with a person, you shouldn't necessarily be talking about them in a bashing sort of way like this. You should instead be able to confront the ideas that they have with your own research. Throughout this entire video, I could have said a lot of things about Dr. Saladino, but I have decided not to, simply because it wouldn't be helpful and it would be actively hurtful to both him and actually to me. Because when someone does something like this that's almost perceived as bullying in a way, then you can actually wind up with the person who's saying those horrible things looking worse than the person that they're actually talking about. Also, as far as this story goes, he made a mistake and he was able to learn from it. Not necessarily everyone has every piece of information on every single topic. And with that, why do we need perfection to be the mark of who we should listen to? If perfection was the mark that we needed in order to listen to someone, we shouldn't listen to anybody, even ourselves, because nobody ultimately is going to be perfect. Also, correct me if I'm wrong about this, but I've never seen Dr. Greger promote elderberries anywhere on any of his social media accounts or on his website.
With the vegans that are thriving, I always wonder, how good would you be if you ate meat?
I know. Well, maybe not. I wonder. I think that there are some people whose ancestors developed in certain parts of the world where maybe meat was scarce. This is a hypothesis. It's just a theory, but I think that it's very likely that there are places that are rich in edible plants and not very rich in wildlife.
Is valid, but it is often, I was eating a diet of junk food.
Right.
I was drinking a lot.
Yep.
And I did this intentional choice, which is freaking amazing. I would give anybody a high five. I think anyone deserves congratulations for making any intentional choice in their diet. I just want to provide information to help them make the best choice.
Right.
And so I think that they've made intentional choices. They've cut out processed seed oils. They've cut out, processed food, and they feel better. And my question is, have you done the other thing?
Right, exactly.
Have you eaten meat and organs? And
have you eaten buffalo?
Yeah.
That's bison that's grazed on like really healthy ground with real good grass.
Have you eaten raw liver, Rich Roll? Because
maybe don't give him that.
So, I happen to be vegan, and I went from an unhealthy diet to a healthy vegan diet. But I don't need to go in and actually eat meat and organ meat to be able to tell that I'm not going to be healthier because of it. And this is because I've gone out there and read some of the scientific literature. And in the scientific literature, there are studies like this one that show that grass-fed beef is not any better than grain-fed beef when looking at a person's heart disease risk. Also, according to this study, people's cholesterol were not affected by switching between beef or chicken, regardless of whether or not they were eating high saturated fat or low saturated fat. However, the plant-based diet dropped their cholesterol pretty significantly. And finally, when you take a study such as the swap meat study and swap actual animal flesh for plant-based meat alternatives, you find some pretty startling results. People were able to drop their weight, lower their LDL and their TMAO levels simply by switching from animal meat to plant-based meat alternatives. And that should all signal that eating those plant-based alternatives even are going to be healthier than eating the actual animal products.
Check this out. You'll appreciate this. So in the evolution folder, Jamie, I don't know if the study will be great to pull up, but there's a study in there, the vegetarian ERP brain study. So they've done studies with vegetarians and vegans and omnivores looking at the EEG. So looking at the electroencephalogram and looking at the way the brain responds at a neocortical and a more basic level. And so the bottom thing there is kind of a complex statement, but you see what they say. The findings suggest that vegetarians' aversion toward non-vegetarian food prevails at the subjective level. And it's consistent with personal beliefs. But at the neural level, the intrinsic motivational salience of animal food remains. So that means that in the deeper brain, they still crave meat.
So this is an interesting one. And I will give credit to Dr. Saladino because he did read this study, and it does say right there that this study concludes that vegetarians do crave meat. But I disagree with the findings of these researchers. I feel like they actually interpreted their own data incorrectly because of this 2018 meta-analysis. If you look at this 2018 meta-analysis, you can actually see that the neural activity inside of a person's brain happens to go up in regards to whether a food is palatable or if it elicits a strong emotional response. Meaning that those vegetarians could have absolutely been repulsed by the food that they were looking at, and it could have measured in the same areas of their brain as if they were desiring it. That seems a more plausible answer than that the vegetarians were actually desiring that food. Not to mention, those same areas of the brain actually are associated with whether a food is inedible, associated with chronic diseases. It seems more likely that the vegetarians were repulsed by a food, thought of it as inedible, or associated it with chronic diseases than actually desired to eat that food in the first place.
We can look, and this is detective work, but we can start to make inferences or guesses at least based on trends and calories from major food groups. This is actually a pretty cool graphic. So the top line there, the green one, is grains. It goes up a little bit, but since 1995, it's gone down. You can even look at sugars and sweeteners. Again, they go up a little bit, but in the last 20 years, they've gone down. And the consumption of meat has gone up, so we'll consider meat as a probable driver. But look at that red line in the middle. You see what that line is?
Yeah.
That's vegetable oil, man. And I don't believe saturated fat is a villain at all. Saturated fat is incredibly healthy for humans when it's from well-sourced animals. But we're eating less saturated fat. That's the blue line, or just essentially exactly the same. So these are not driving it. Red meat is not driving it. Nobody thinks chicken is driving the chronic disease epidemic. And then you look at 10.18.19, we're eating more plant foods. And I'm not saying that plant foods are driving this, but that doesn't look like we're going in, like that's certainly not, And the real driver here, I suspect, is the last one, Jamie. If you look at the consumption of vegetable oil by Americans since 1910, and that is a staggering amount.
You don't want to skateboard that ramp.
Except one thing slips through the cracks in this. If consumption of everything has remained essentially the same over the amount of time that we're looking at, but polyunsaturated fats have gone up, where did those calories go? Those calories would have gone up. And that's exactly what we see when we look at this review. Over time, portion sizes and calories have gone up in proportion to the obesity epidemic, meaning that it's probably not the polyunsaturated fat directly causing this, but the consumption of more calories overall that's driving the obesity epidemic.
And then you can get into all of the reasons this might be doing this, but as I kind of dug into this, it gets a little bit deep in the weeds, but at a molecular level, these polyunsaturated fats, they act differently in our body, and we don't fully have this figured out. But at the level of our mitochondria, it does look like these polyunsaturated fats, this linoleic acid-rich vegetable oil, is signaling things differently. And I think it's really, there's a lot of compelling evidence to suggest that linoleic acid is driving adipocyte hypertrophy, meaning fat cells are getting bigger. And fat cells can do two things. They can get bigger or they can divide. When fat cells get big and they don't divide, they eventually start leaking out inflammatory mediators, leaking out free fatty acids. And so what you see is you start to see this interesting set of data that points to the fact that maybe all these excess linoleic acid is driving our fat cells to get really big, but isn't allowing them to divide the way they're supposed to.
He tries to use some mechanistic data to prove that polyunsaturated fats are actually causing people to become more fat than if they were eating a different type of fat. However, this is not the case. And if we look at this study, saturated fats are actually the most fattening when over-consuming calories as compared to both simple sugars and polyunsaturated fats. And this, because it's done in people, is a lot better to look at than something that's done on the cellular level.
So if you look at this is the basic data from Framingham, okay? This is correlation, this is epidemiology. Increasing risk of cardiovascular disease on the y-axis, LDL on the x-axis, okay? So it's things like this that make people say, oh yeah, LDL, it's probably causing atherosclerosis, which is the formation of plaque within the arterial wall. So this is the exact same data stratified by a third variable. And this is what is never considered with LDL, in my opinion. The lipid hypothesis is flawed because it's incomplete. It misses the third variable or fourth variable. In this stratification, we've looked at HDL.
It says increasing LDL is very little increase in the cardiovascular disease risk with high HDL.
So, while HDL cholesterol is often seen to be protective, that's not always the case, especially in the presence of saturated fat. So HDL cholesterol can actually be oxidized in the same way that LDL cholesterol can, and it loses its protective ability at that point. Oxidized HDL cholesterol is associated with a worse CAC scan than people who don't have nearly as much of that. And that specific sort of scan is something that Dr. Saladino himself relies upon as a way to determine whether people are at risk for heart disease. Also, the type of fat that makes up your cholesterol has an effect too. So cholesterol is going to be made up of the fats that you eat in your diet. Therefore, your HDL cholesterol can be made of monounsaturated fat, polyunsaturated fat, or saturated fats. When a person has even one meal that is high in saturated fat, you can not only see a difference in their HDL cholesterol, it's less protective for your epithelial cells than when a person had a meal that was higher in either mono or polyunsaturated fats. Really, if you want your HDL cholesterol to function the way he's talking about it here, you're going to want to be eating not saturated fat, but polyunsaturated fat instead. So this really was a lot and probably is a fairly long video. So if you watched all of this, congrats! And if you have any ideas for content for this channel, please leave it down in the comment section. I love to hear from everyone, and I want to know your ideas of what you want to see on this channel. Alright, so I really hope that you learned something today, and that you always remember to love God, eat greens, and get moving. See you in the next video.